All right, it is another beautiful day in Scotland. It is warm with a gentle breeze. I'm walking along a field with Nora. I'm looking out into the horizon right now. I can see the ocean from where I am. Beautiful, nice, clear sky. Waves aren't too big. Anyway, our guest today is Erin Eleu, and Erin is our second ever repeat guest. I really want to get Erin on because last time I talked to her about 2 years ago, I learned a lot. I really enjoyed the conversation. But in the last 2 years, I think that she has really come up with some great new ideas. I think a lot of her thinking has coalesced. She's someone who's always had good ideas and has always been an excellent communicator. But really, I think in the last year and a half, she's really been putting out some unique content and has been just communicating, I think, some very powerful ideas. So, for those of you who don't know Erin, she's the founder of Agents of Movement. I think that she's one of the most thoughtful and progressive leaders in the sort of space of working with older adults in movement. The reason I wanted to get her on is I did attend a few of her webinars recently where she's sort of been expanding a bit on her thoughts regarding fall resilience, creating playful opportunities and social opportunities for older adults. And I just thought that they were so good. Throughout all her webinars, she really talks a lot about this idea of social frailty. So a lot of people might know the fear of falling cycle, but she's really been looking at the social aspects. And she has this great line where she says, often in the fitness industry, we're very good at looking at bodies, but ignoring the whole person. And she's really sort of developed this holistic way of looking at how important the social connections are and all those other little hard to define variables that don't show up in a spreadsheet but are so important just for human beings to thrive and feel like they're valued and important.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, I'm here today with Erin Eleu, who I think is our second ever two-time guest. So, Erin, thanks so much for coming on again. Really appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again.
I want to be honest, I wanted to get you on because I think you've been up to a lot of cool things in the last year and a half. And I looked at the previous episode that we had done and it came out like January of 2025. So, a year and a half ago. And I think you've just been really, really active online. I know you've been doing lots of webinars. I know you've been doing lots of collaborations. You've done a rebrand. So it's been a busy year for you. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself briefly. Now, for anyone who wants the long bio, they can go ahead and listen to our previous episode. But just introduce yourself more along the lines of some changes that have happened maybe since the last time we spoke.
Yes, so I host a podcast called Agents of Movement, and it's a platform where I provide webinars as well as different podcast guests on people who are innovators, educators in this field of keeping people active. I rebranded September of last year of 2025 to Agents of Movement Iowa Second Act Fit Pros. So I'm taking much more of a focus on movement leaders and how we get people moving and in meaningful ways across their lifetime. I work with older adults in senior living communities and senior centers, and I work a lot using skills of parkour to keep people fall resilient, strength training, all of that. But I work with older adults and I have a background in working with older adults. But that's really where my platform is right now, and it's shifted, it's evolved. Talking to people like yourself, Andrew, and what you and Jill are doing have definitely shaped my work and influenced me heavily. So that's where I'm at today.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I want to get you on is because I do feel like your thinking has evolved. And like I was saying off mic, I mean, you've been a fitness professional, movement leader for a long time, and I think that you've always had very good and clear messaging, but I do feel like something has shifted in the last year or two. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell me how has your thinking changed in the last year or so, or has your focus changed, or maybe are you thinking about different aspects that perhaps you weren't before?
Yes, my thinking has been much more around how do we keep people active in general and not so much fitness. That is part of it. Of course, there is a fitness aspect to it, but it's all the ways that we can keep people active, but more importantly, socially connected. So I feel like movement is a way to keep people socially connected. It's just the means that we can use to keep people socially connected. But I think that's really the most important part of us as movement leaders, is to have that social connection piece. And yes, of course, the movement is important and we want to keep people active and challenge them. But the social connections really are the most important thing. And I think they become increasingly important as we get older, and having a sense of community and belonging, and having a place that people feel like they want to come back to. I really feel like that lays the foundation for keeping people active. So a lot of what my focus has been in, like, how do we create those meaningful experiences for people, and how are we delivering classes, not just what we're delivering, which I feel like that's a lot of the focus on certifications and training, is, what are the physical components that we're teaching, but it's really more about the how. And the how for me is a lot of the psychology that comes in, the language that we use for our classes, how we welcome people into the space, and looking all those surrounding elements to that experience people are getting when they're coming into any kind of physical activity session. So this spans everything from, CrossFit to rock climbing, whatever that movement space is. I think that us as leaders can be really thoughtful and intentional about how we're delivering those sessions.
Yeah, I think that distinction between what versus how is really, really important. And it's interesting because you were sort of talking about how your thinking has evolved in it. I think it aligns with a lot of people in this space where I think when we're younger, it is maybe comforting or easier to focus on the numbers or the performance aspect, which is really important. Like you said, it is important that we, design activities and provide opportunities that are not just meaningful, but also provide appropriate levels of challenge so people can grow and adapt and things like that. But, I think when I first started, I was so concerned about, numbers on the spreadsheet. And I think that's one of the things that I think is quite interesting is, sometimes I see people make criticisms about any kind of, I don't know, community leader, movement leader that focuses on the social. And I think sometimes there's assumptions like, well, don't you know about progressive overload? Don't you know about linear progression? Don't about, you don't even have people squatting or whatever. And I think it's like, yeah, I used to believe that too. But when you start working with people on the ground, you realize that there's so many more important things. And it's great if you can get people to do those things. But for me, I found that one of the biggest things is just getting people to show up and then seeing what you can do with them. So I think that what versus how distinction, like you said, it's kind of like the difference between what you might learn in a textbook or a personal training course versus that difference of when you're actually out there doing it. Sometimes, that distinction people will talk about metis versus techne, which is like, that hands-on experience versus textbook learning. They are totally different things. So within that, I'd like to get into some of the specifics. So what are some of the things you focused on? Like you mentioned, like creating a sense of community and creating like a sense of welcoming. What are some other things that you have really thought about in the last year or so in terms of building community and creating space?
Yeah, I think of the environments that we create, so the language that we use in our classes, how we're describing our classes, and it sounds like little things, but I always say that the little things are the big things. Knowing people's names, how you welcome them into a class. When you talk about classes, are you saying you're going to do this, or is it we're going to do this? So we're in this together. Are we talking about decline? We want to balance so you don't break your hip, or are we talking about we're going to balance so we can be steady and strong? And also, I think that also goes into paying attention to other people's language. So a lot of times I've heard in classes, my balance is bad, my knees are bad, which gives you insight into people's beliefs about their bodies and what they're capable of. And somebody that believes that and says that, they're going to show up to move in a different mindset than somebody that maybe doesn't believe that or doesn't say that. So how do we as leaders help them reframe that? Your balance isn't bad, but you're coming here to learn balance. You're coming here to improve your balance. Your knees aren't bad, but maybe there's another way we can talk about that. Your knees got you here to class. Is there an opportunity for your knees to heal, or what can we do within maybe an injury you're working with? So I think it's up to us as leaders to help people to reframe those beliefs and talk about things in the framework of possibility. And creating those opportunities for social interaction are really important as well. So like I said, knowing people's names, knowing something about them, introducing people to each other in class, having space and time for people to talk before and after class, during class, all of those things are really add up to a much more pleasurable experience for people. And again, it seems like little things, but they are the big things. And when we pay attention to those things again, we're thinking about the how of a class. How are we bringing people into this space? How are they experiencing this? How can we make it better? It's not so much the what, but those are the things that I think about when I deliver a class, and those are the things I like to talk about on my podcast and with other movement leaders to help improve um, the experience that people are having.
Yeah, it's one of the things we always talk about when we run our trainings is we really try to get the participants to think about the why, which obviously ties in with the how, but really thinking about, well, why are we doing this? Because if we just focus on the what, it's easy to just focus on the numbers or just forcing people to do certain movements or whatever, but really thinking about like what is the benefit here? What are we bringing? Why are people coming to this, and then I think and you did a really good job of addressing that. Sometimes there are all these little granular details that are so hard to quantify, but all those things add up, A, to people coming back, and B, to people making progress. And I think sometimes if we focus too much on ensuring that people are using heavier weights or hitting certain percentages, of whatever intensity, I think sometimes we lose all those really important little bits, like those social connection aspects that are really important. You mentioned language, and I think you always do a great job talking about language, and I always learn a lot from you when you talk about that. But one of the things you mentioned just a few minutes ago was how you describe your classes, because it's one of the things that I still it's not that I struggle with sometimes as I vacillate, I go back and forth, and it's one of the most common questions we have in our courses as well, is how people can communicate what it is that they're doing. And you can think about, I want you to think about any of the classes that you offer, even maybe sometimes when you talk about parkour inspired classes and things like that, because sometimes people can sometimes be afraid of that sort of language. So how do you do it, and how do you also maybe tailor different classes and descriptions to different groups and different needs?
Yeah, I think it comes down to outcomes and who's it for and what's the desired outcome of the class. Like this class is going to help you build confidence moving around your space. It's for people that, maybe want an extra challenge, talk about getting up and down from the floor if that's something that you're going to be doing in class. I found that those descriptions tend to work best for people. I will say parkour is an interesting one. I've myself and my colleagues have tried to find different vocabulary for that because some people don't know what parkour is, but it's also you're talking about giving them different movement experiences, different skills. And I don't think people really understand that. So I think parkour in particular is best, quote unquote, sold by images than it is by words. It's just really hard to explain what you're doing in class until you see it. And then people are like, oh, yes, those are movement things that I don't do anymore, or I can see where that would benefit me. I can see where that would be fun. So parkour is kind of an interesting one, but generally speaking, it is about outcomes and it is about and who's it for, so that the right people are, and I say quote unquote right people, are coming to class, because there's nothing more discouraging for the leader and for the participant than when you have somebody coming into a class that is not going to have a good experience. Whether you're teaching a really challenging class and you have somebody coming in that has some severe limitations, that's not going to be a good experience for either party. And reverse, like if you're doing something that's a little bit more gentle, more beginner focused, and you have somebody that wants something challenging, like that, nobody wins in that scenario. So I really am very particular about getting away from this terminology you see a lot in fitness descriptions, is suitable for all levels. And that can't be true. And I know we want to cast a wide net and get as many people involved in our classes as possible, and we don't want to turn people away. But, and I've said this before, is like when you meet an older person, like you've met, one older person, and the range of capabilities for older adults is so vast. There's no way that we can have one class that caters to people that are doing the Senior Olympics, and that same class can deliver something meaningful for somebody that's in advanced neuromuscular disease. Like there's just no way. So the more precise we can be with our language in the classes and who it's for, the better it's going to be for everybody. We can't be everything to everyone. So we need to be much more targeted in who our programs are for. And that's being, I heard this term called generously exclusive. And that's what it is. It's ensuring that people are going to have a good experience. And I think that term is from Priya Parker.
I just got her book.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is a really good term, and I think it's one of the things can be really hard, especially when people are first starting off trying to build their own community, is to sometimes recognize that, what I'm currently offering, at least at this specific class, isn't going to be appropriate for everybody. And I think sometimes it's really hard for people to say that because they do want to make everything for everybody. But you're right. Whenever you design anything, whatever you decide to include, you're also conversely deciding what's excluded. It's like when you're trying to build a model or write a book. You can't write a book about everything, but it is really hard. And I think that's one of the things, especially when we start working with older communities, is realizing that it's okay to be clear about what the class is going to entail. And we have a new course coming up, and one of the things that we asked people who want to participate is you have to be able to get down to the ground and back up again. And we felt bad about that, but it did mean that we were able to focus on other things that would be meaningful for that group, and then we can come back and hopefully offer something else that's meaningful to other groups. I think you're right about the photos as well. Sometimes it's really hard to describe, and we obviously do a lot of videos as well, but you show someone a photo and you see people laughing and moving and having a good time, and even more so with the video, if you can hear people laughing when they're doing these things, people can look and it's like, okay, cool, I get it, I see what's happening here, in a way that's so hard to describe, because I often find myself in this trap of describing what it's not. I'm like, well, it's not a boot camp, and it's not really CrossFit, and it's not chair yoga. And it's very, very hard. And that's what we often say is, well, you have to come around, or, we've spent some time, we've cut a few videos we can share with people. But I think that is it. And I go back and forth. I think sometimes these things are getting easier to explain sometimes, because I think people's idea of what's possible in fitness and movement or exercise or physical activity, I think people are being exposed to more ideas. But sometimes it is really hard to explain to people that, it's not going to be a boot camp. No one's going to get yelled at, but we are going to have a good time and, hopefully be challenged a little bit as well. Um, One of the things I wanted to get you on for is because I've really seen you talking about this recently, is this idea of, well, there's lots of different cycles out there, so a lot of listeners will know fear of falling cycle, or pain avoidance cycle, or yeah, I mean, really any of the avoidance cycles, social anxiety, avoidance cycles. But you've really been talking about this idea of the social frailty cycle, and you have a graphic that you use that I really like. I was wondering if you could kind of explain, well, really what that's all about, and sort of why you've been focusing on this over the last few months.
Yes. So, as I mentioned, the social aspect to me is super important. And when I was looking at this idea of social frailty and how it relates to falls, it totally clicked with me. And so, there's actually been research done on this about how that disconnection people have with their communities, with their friends, their neighbors, that really brings forth a lot of reduced activity. So, you think about somebody and I see this a lot happen in senior living communities where someone is taken out of their home. They can no longer manage a big home and they've lost a spouse. And so now their children move them closer to them. So now they're in a senior living community that's close to their children, but they've left all of their friends. They've left the home that they've been in for so long. They've lost their spouse. So there's a lot of loss there and a lot of grief there. And now they have reduced activity because of that disconnection. They've lost a lot of those social connections. And that reduced activity, we know, results in declining strength, declining balance. They're not moving as much. There's this depression, there's this grief there. And that, again, starts that cycle. We know when people don't move that they're going to reduce their capabilities and their strength. And so now they reduce their confidence in turn. So they don't have the belief that they can manage stairs or do things that they used to do because they haven't been moving. And now they're at an increased fall risk. So that increased fall risk. If they're at fear of falling, we know that that is a big risk factor for falling, and they further withdraw. So it becomes this cycle of disconnection, reduced activity, declining strength, lower confidence, increased fall risk, more withdrawal. And it's just this repeating cycle. And the good news is that really anywhere along that cycle, we can intervene. Maybe a further withdrawal, we can definitely look at that and encourage people, but we can intervene and help get people involved and understand the social context that they're in to provide that social activity. Because so much of the time we look at physical aspects for people's risk of falling. Can they stand on one leg? What's their sit to stand? What is their timed up and go? And those are all physical factors, but we don't know the social context that those lie in. And that is the underlying cause for a lot of this reduced strength, balance, speed, power. So I feel like the social aspect and it's been shown that it is a very important part of why people are at fall risk. So we really have to look at the whole person, their whole lives, and not just assess, one physical assessment and be like, okay, well, your leg strength is not there. So we're going to work on strengthening your legs. We're going to get you doing some power exercises without realizing really what's at the root cause of that reduced strength or power output.
Yeah, there's a couple directions we can go with this, but as you're talking about that, I started smiling because I remembered probably about a year ago, I was in a meeting with a group of biomechanists at a university, and they were interested in studying the efficacy of social programs and falls prevention. And I was talking about, well, we really want to make sure we embed it in the context of what people are doing. In this case, we know that people lose confidence in being outside. So we try to get people on, slightly uneven surfaces and working with this and playing games and playing around with sense of urgency and a healthy sense of competition to get people to speed up and, talking about all these things. And I remember I was cut off. It's like, well, yeah, but we're going to need to do it in the lab because we need to go ahead and see what hip angles and knee angles people are at. We need to see what ground reaction forces are being produced so we can show that this, and this. And I tried so many different angles to say, look, I know it's very hard to measure, but it could be in this case that the whole actually doesn't need to be reduced down to hip flexion angle or dorsiflexion angle or things like that. And I just realized there's no way that I could get the group to see eye to eye. And it's not because they were wrong in the context of what they studied. The biomechanists were right. They wanted to look at things through a biomechanical lens. But then at the same time, I think over and over and over again, we do disregard this complex, and social lens. Um, with what you've been talking about, I think it's something that often public health does very, very well, but it's something that I think traditionally the private fitness industry does not do very well. There does seem to be this disconnect, and I don't know if it's because maybe there's more money in showing young people, there's more money in targeting people who are still quite healthy and capable. I'm not sure of what it is, but I was just thinking about this idea, the concept of a personal trainer, which is sort of like the standard unit in the private fitness industry. Um, and I do feel like there's need for some way to kind of bridge that gap. So is that something you ever think about? Is maybe the disconnect between the private fitness industry and perhaps whatever something else, a different model that could be more effective?
Yes, I think about this a lot. I do feel like, in general, I mean, the fitness industry is very much focused on bodies and less focused on people. But it's easy to see why, because it's very objective. You can do a timed up and go test with somebody, give them exercise prescription and test them again and be like, see, I improved their timed up and go. I improved their sit to stand. It's very measurable, and there can be a lot of reward in that. And this is what I feel like what we're talking about is more of the soft stuff, right? The soft feel good things. And how do you measure that? And I have more questions than answers to this, but so that it is meaningful, you get meaningful outcomes from this. And they have seen that, like, people that are doing things that are social and group settings, they do want to come back to that. It improves, what fitness loves to call exercise adherence. That you're coming back and continuing to do this thing, and so there, that to from what I've seen, that's kind of the extent that we've shown. Like, yes, if it's group, it's people want to keep coming back to it, but it's much more than that. It's that human experience, that connection that's being driven. And I do feel like the fitness industry is just, it's more about bodies than it is the psychology, and the social connections. And that's, I'm trying to get that into the fitness industry because because it is such a huge miscomponent to fitness is it's just not being looked at. And I don't know, I don't know the best way to do that, but it's so important.
Yeah, I'm glad it's a conversation that we're hearing more and more. And again, good thing about the internet is it does allow people to reach out and do podcasts and share ideas and things like that. One of one of the interesting tensions that I see sometimes is this tension between this idea of personal practice. Whether it's going to the gym, 3 times a week and measuring all your numbers, or even in gymnastics and yoga, this idea of spending time by yourself and sort of getting better at things versus doing things together. And I think sometimes there's this assumption, I don't know the answer to this, but sometimes there's this assumption that if we do things in groups, we can't really see meaningful progress, that the meaningful progress has to come from a personal practice and, doing your 3 days a week in the gym or whatever context you do that in. Is that something that you think about and try to balance out?
To me, it's never an either or, it's a both and. There is definitely scenarios, and it's so individual where, um, I've had instances where I've had people come to a group class and they're a very high fall risk. And you can just tell when they stand up that they are very unstable. And it's going to be best for them and you as a leader for them to be pretty much mostly seated because it's a group setting, right? You're one person to 10. You can't give them that individual attention. So it's not to say that person should never do any standing exercises, but maybe in the group context, it's not appropriate or safe. But, for that person to be doing more individual training, that would be maybe best for that person. So I think it's very individualized, and it's not one or the other. There's so much good about doing group programs, and depending on the person's scenario, there's great evidence doing individualized programs. And that sometimes that social connection doesn't have to be a group setting. It can be the connection you have with your trainer, with your physical therapist, and that gives you a reason, a purpose to keep coming back. So I do think some people think of it as like either or, and it's really never is. It's both and it just depends on the individual's personality and their needs.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that one. It's very easy to fall into these false dichotomies, but they don't need to be separate things. Um, I'm just thinking out loud here, because as you were talking, it got me thinking about things. What are some of the ripple effects that you think you've seen by working with older adults in terms of like building up their confidence and their capabilities? And what I mean is things that maybe don't show up in the class itself, but what are some stories that you've heard from people? It's like, oh, I've been doing your course for or your classes for a few months, and then all of a sudden this happened, or all of a sudden I've discovered this. Have you seen any examples of that?
Yes, I would say the biggest thing is the boost in confidence in their movement skills. So, some of the things that I've heard from my participants, and this was one recently, was she was out hiking with her husband, and her husband just inadvertently like kicked this stick over into her pathway, and she tripped over it, and she kind of had to do this, this power step, this quick step to dodge the stick, and she didn't fall, and she was able to continue hiking, and it didn't stop her from hiking. So she's like, yeah, that was a near miss, but I adapted, I got around that object, and I kept hiking. And so she kept doing her activities. The fear wasn't so great. One, she didn't fall and injure herself, and two, she kept going, and it didn't stop her from continuing to hike. And that's been a big thing that I've seen actually come up yesterday in a class. Was we talked about, when you're out hiking, there's rocks and there's sticks on the ground, and there's just lots of ways that you have to be able to move around your environment, and building that confidence and hearing that they feel more confident going out to more rugged terrain, and that they feel like they can adapt to that, and and falling, they've taken some falls, and they said, but I rolled with it. We talk about rolling with the momentum and rolling into the fall, and I didn't get injured. So they're talking about successful falls that they have, which is something that we don't talk a lot about. We love to talk about so and so fell and broke their hip and the mortality risk with that and scare people. But I really encourage my participants to talk about those near misses, what they did, talk about it in the classroom setting, and those falls that they had, that I have. Everybody falls. And I think normalizing falling is really important. So that's really what I've seen, is that confidence and the ability to adapt to their environment and know that I could fall, and I've learned skills to adapt to that.
I think the example you gave, that sort of, almost that sliding doors moment of, you could imagine the woman who was going and almost tripped on the stick. You see how it could have gone in two different ways, and I think those are really powerful. The idea of sharing, and I like this term, the successful falls in the group, I think is really powerful. It's one of the things we like to do as well, is really try to get the group to talk about, yeah, any of their wins or anything they've noticed, and I think that makes a huge difference. And I think you're right, normalizing the falling. And I know it's something we probably talked about the last time we had you on, is when we fall into this language of fall prevention. If someone has a fall, then they feel like they failed somehow. And I guess that's really where I'd like to take the conversation next, because I know you've been doing some presentations. And actually, I joined one of your webinars a few weeks ago. You're doing the Healthy Aging and Falls Free Wisconsin Coalition, and I know you've done some other ones as well. But could you kind of talk about how your thoughts on falls, fall resiliency, fall preparedness, sort of everything in that cluster, that conversation. How has that evolved in the last few years, and what are you doing in that space?
Yeah, fall resiliency and fall preparedness is two terms that I really try to bring to the forefront a lot when I'm talking to professionals and when I'm talking to older adults. Is how can we be prepared for falls? How can we be more resilient to falls? That needs to be married with fall prevention. Fall prevention gets a lot of press, and there's something to be said for it. Yes, there are absolutely ways that we can prevent falling. Um, and the other thing is that we make this an older adult issue. Like, this is something that older adults need to worry about, fall prevention. And how many times do we hear fall prevention for older adults, fall prevention for seniors? And I think that actually really turns the targeted audience off in a really big way, ironically enough. And I've heard this from professionals on my podcast, and I've heard this from an instructor. She said, yeah, I did a fall prevention program for seniors and nobody showed up, but I called it strength and balance and I had 20 people. And I'm like, yes, because we're talking about possibility over decline. Like, what are we working towards? We're working on strength and balance. We're not working on don't fall. And it doesn't resonate with people. So the terminology that we use around fall prevention, I think just being sensitive to when we use the word falls makes a big difference, because I think older adult, you don't want to hear that that's an older person thing. And some people don't identify with being an older person. They don't think that's for me. And, I've used this picture. I mean, my dad was doing sports into like his late 60s, and he was surfing into his late 60s. And I used this picture and I said, this person is not going to go to a class called Fall Prevention for Seniors. So we need to think about how we advertise these classes. So the verbiage is really important, and making, and again, talking about falls and normalizing it, that this is not something that just happens to older people. This is something that happens to all humans. And I think it takes that shame away from people. Like, oh, I've heard this from class participants. I've actually heard it from a family member who had a really bad, unlucky fall. Like, anybody would have fallen in this situation. And she said, well, I guess that's what's happened now because I'm older. And I was like, no, that's not true. Like, in that situation, anybody would have fallen. And a lot of these things that can increase someone's risk for falling, that can be more prevalent in the older adult population: loss of vision, loss of hearing, vestibular issues. Those are all modifiable risk factors. That's not something that's fixed. And so when we make this an older adult thing, I think it turns a lot of those people away. And when we normalize it, we talk about it. We talk about successful falls. We don't talk about the mortality risk with that. I don't mention any of that in my classes. I just don't. I don't think that creating fear for people inspires them to do balance exercises. I think it actually does the opposite. I think it actually perpetuates more fear. And now we're adding a risk factor for them because fear of falling is a risk factor. And now we've made them more fearful. So we're doing the opposite of what we want to do. So thinking about that differently and teaching people how to fall. And I would really love to, my fall classes, I do advertise to my older adults and the senior center and the senior living communities, but I would love to see adults of all ages come in and learn that. And I compare it to swimming. Like it's a skill that's valuable skill to have. And whether you're 30 or whether you're 80, it's important to have. And same with balance. Balance is not an older person thing. Balance is just a really useful thing to be able to do no matter what your age is. So we have to be opening up the conversation to all ages. And I think that's a really important part of this.
I think that's so true. And in the UK, there's been a renewed interest in this idea of physical literacy, which people argue about the definition. But like I've really been thinking about it in terms of like attunement to the physical world, and what I mean is just maximizing your opportunities to interact with the world around you in different meaningful ways. And the falling, I think, is really important. I did a falls course, like a trainer course years ago, and they talked about meeting the ground and receiving the ground, and it wasn't even in the context of what would happen if you fall. It was like all these different creative ways that you can kind of get to the ground at different speeds in different ways. And there's sort of like this. I guess I should mention for podcast listeners, it was Nil Teasner who had this falling and rising course, and I really loved the language because none of it was couched in this idea of falls prevention and mortality. It was all about like play and how you can play around. And it's one of these things you hear a lot of people who have theater backgrounds and they do the theater fighting and things like that. They learn how to fall and roll. And some of my favorite stories that I have of these successful falls are stories like I can't remember where I heard this, but it's the story I remember one of my friends used to tell all the time. And his grandfather, it was during Thanksgiving, and he went down in the basement to get something from the basement. I think this was in America, and whatever happened, they heard the bump 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 bump, and everyone rushed down to see the grandfather. And he had just rolled all the way because when he was younger, he was in theater, and he knew how to fall, and he just got back up, and it was fine. And again, it was the story that didn't happen. It was something that didn't turn into so and so had a fall. It was like, oh yeah, grandpa did this cool roll down the stairs. And obviously that's not necessarily realistic for everyone, but this I do think having the opportunities to use your body in different ways and express these different capabilities and these different, abilities to do tasks, I think is so important. It's another one of these things that I think sometimes gets lost when we focus on specific gym workouts, is that a lot of times people have never grown up with these opportunities to use their bodies in different ways, and then it doesn't really become visible until they get older, and then all of a sudden it's something that's that turns into a medical issue or is pathologized. Where I do sort of feel like we could kind of push the curve if more people had the opportunity just to use their bodies in different ways. So they did pick up on these things like swimming and maintaining running and being able to go out and surf and you know doing theater fighting classes so they learn how to fall and roll and basic acrobatics and things like all that's just going to build up in this sort of web of resiliency. That I think if people are just hyper specialized and only think about gym as like the only way of moving, it's not going to confer, I think, the same richness of benefits.
Yes. And this is where I feel like it goes back to the images where you talk about giving people movement skills and they're like, well, I go to gym class and I go and I exercise and I walk. But when people actually see those movements, people rolling on the ground, hanging from things, I think something clicks. You're like, oh yeah. I mean, even for myself, like I don't do that anymore. Like you don't have a reason to do that anymore because we have so many affordances in our modern society. So that's where I think the imaging comes in and people get it. And we talk a lot about like moving like a kid because it's what kids naturally do. But when you see adults do it, it is something clicks. You're like, yes, we've gotten away from so many of our movement patterns that we used to do as a kid. And you just don't even think about it.
And when you do see it, you're right. There is like this sort of sense of delight when you see people moving in unexpected ways and seeing what people are capable of. I think that is one of the interesting things about games and, setting constraints and things like that. You never know what's going to emerge. And it's always amazing sometimes what people are capable of if you just sort of give them the space and the support and the context. What you said is, people don't have a reason to move like that anymore. And I wrote that down. I underlined it because I think that'd be an interesting tagline is to create reasons to move. I think is a very nice way of explaining one way of how people can design and plan activities. Um, going back to the falling, just because I was in the workshop that you did, it's it's a big question, and obviously it's not like people aren't going to listen to the podcast and go out and create their own course. But what are some of the things that you think about if you're going to do a webinar or someone asks you to could you come out and with this group, maybe there's I don't know, maybe there's like a judo hall or something like that and they have some mats, or there's a village hall that has gymnastics mats, and someone were to say, hey, we would like for you to give a little talk about falling, and that's obviously a big question, but not really knowing the group, what would start going through your head if you were going to plan a session, you were going to introduce some ideas about falling? Where would you start? And what kind of activities would you have in mind over time? Maybe not to do in one session, but what were some goals that you would have if you're going to work with a group?
Yeah, I think so. I recently just had a how to fall class just last week. And one of the things I talked about is one, like why this is just a human thing that happens to all of us. It's just part of being human. And I think I ask people to reflect on a time that they fell, because everyone in this room has fallen, and think about what was the context within that fall, like what happened that you fell, and think about maybe a bad fall, maybe they get more injured, and a fall that maybe you caught yourself, you didn't go all the way down, or you didn't get injured, and what happened in both of those instances. Like kind of reflect on the context of the fall, because I think that's such an important part. People think like, did you fall, yes or no? And there's so much more to it than that. So talking about a past experience with falling is important, and then talking about the importance of having it as a movement skill, because again, I do compare it to swimming or something that's useful. And it's kind of like your insurance policy on your body is you know I know how to not have a fire in my house, but I also have a fire extinguisher in my house. So it's kind of that same idea, is like, we don't expect to fall unless we're going to do things to keep ourselves safe, but these things happen, and it's normal. And um, another thing I think about is, again, because it is a movement skill, is that it's making deposits into what I like to call your physiological 401k, and that we're going to do these things while we know we can. And it's making deposits so that if we have to draw upon these movement skills at a later date, we can, because we've been making those deposits into our physiological 401k. And you do that at any age. You start making those deposits, because you don't know what life is going to hand you down the line. So I comparing it to that, I think, helps to people understand the importance of it, and understand that it happens to everyone. And maybe there's a way that I can learn to do this that is that will keep me safe, but also like having fun with this. Like this, it shouldn't be so serious. Sometimes we take movement so seriously, and it's really about bringing some levity to this, and fun rolling on the ground and making it playful. Because the seriousness, I think, can draw people away.
I'm gonna, in case Gabby's listening to this, we had a participant in one of our classes, Gabby, and last time we ran this, I also use the analogy of a 401k, or like putting deposits into your movement surplus. And she called me up on it. And she's like, everyone always uses this analogy, and it's always about money. And she was like, can we do something else? So the class got together, and we were thinking, and there were a lot of gardeners in the class. So someone mentioned the idea of building up the soil, like this permacultural idea of building up the soil and creating as many cross connections and, rich bacteria and rhizomatic, fungal connections and things like that. And, they said, if you build up the soil, it means that, if it's a dry season, the soil will be more resilient. Whatever you plant is going to grow better. You don't need to worry about fertilizer and things like that, as long as you have a good, rich soil. So I'm only bringing that up because I know Gabby listens to podcasts sometimes, and she'd get cross at me if I didn't mention the permaculture angle, which I think is a nice one. Even though I still use the putting in deposits in.
Oh, I like that. I like that. That's great.
The permaculture space is really interesting, actually. It's got a lot of interesting crossover with movement and resiliency and things like that. And the more, the more I think about how to teach them this stuff, the more I realize there's a lot of wisdom in, organic farming and that kind of thing. So, but I want to get back to falling. So you talked about building context, and having people think about it. And then I think this idea of having fun is really important. And just like you said, when you talk about falling, you talk about statistics, you talk about mortality, you just see people sort of hunch up and get tight. And that's really the exact opposite of what we want. So I think you're right. If we can make it fun and just have people rolling around on the ground, having a good time, giggling, that's really good too. Are there any specific things like in terms of structure or positions that you want to work people towards when you think about this, or is it, or any activities? The reason I'm asking is just because I've seen so many different fall programs, and it's really interesting to see what different programs have in common and what they don't have in common. And I always just enjoy learning how people sort of look at this space and then decide what they want to focus on.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just including those principles of a good fall, right? A successful fall, and letting people play around with that. So I talk a lot about being a floppy human. We don't want straight lines. We want to be soft. And I love this visual, and I stole this from a colleague of mine, Patricia Linderman, and she uses, we have a PVC pipe and we have a chain. And when you let the PVC pipe go, it's just like a falling tree, like bam. You're going to have a lot of impact with that. Whereas the chain crumples to the ground, right? It softens and it lands. So I give them that visual, which I think is really helpful for them to think this is what we want to do with our bodies. We want to soften into it, we want to reduce the impact. And I think that just that visual alone really helps people think about how they want to land, whether you're teaching them sideways, backwards, forwards, and you can give them, different skills with that. But it's like, how can you soften into it? How can you be floppy with it? And let them know that this is not a perfect thing. It's not going to look pretty. It's just a matter of noticing your impact when you come down. Where your impact lies. Is it on the meaty parts of your body, or is it on the bony parts of your body? What's happening with your head? Bringing some awareness to that, and then letting them move within that context of softening, protecting the head, no straight lines. And so there's just kind of like an outline for them to follow, but giving them some freedom with that. And really having, obviously, a soft place to land is really hugely important. And that's why I've done this at a ninja gym, where they have like really big soft fluffy mats, and like the whole floor is like a big soft fluffy mat. And it's amazing because it just gives people a lot of opportunity to move, to roll, to come up, without their knees being on hard surfaces. So that setting really makes a big difference. But yeah, freedom to move. Like, this is our objective: soften the impact. These are ways you can do this. Have fun, and show them obviously different ways of going sideways, backwards, but just bringing some awareness on what they're doing with their bodies.
I think I've heard you use the pole chain sort of analogy before, and you're right. It's great. You can just also imagine if one were to do it with the pole versus the chain, just like the sound, it has such a tactile resonance. You're right that people can really just learn a lot from that. I think that's just a really powerful sort of model to give people, because you can. There's so many ways just to explain it. And I'm physically, like, I'm a pretty rigid person for whatever reason. I don't know if that's my personality, or just from too many years of, like, powerlifting and weightlifting and things like that. I think I spent so much time learning how to become rigid and stiff. Um, and I know for me, one of the best parts about kind of switching training modalities is just sort of embracing that softness. You're right. Like letting yourself become a floppy human being it's actually really nice. And you're right. Once you can just roll around and go with it, it's just a very fun way just to train and to be and to play around. Um, we're getting close to the end of the time. We have a few minutes, and I just really want to make sure that I left some time to talk about any future projects or collaboration you're working on. And I know that you've also started focusing more on additional online classes and things like that. So I just wanted to give you some space to talk about different things you've been working on.
Yeah, so every month I hold a webinar with some kind of professional in the field talking about different ways that we can elevate our skills as movement leaders. So, and just introducing people to different modalities of movement. So I've done everything from, we did a class on parkour and making it accessible for different ability levels. Ballroom basics for balance is another one we've done. Looking at adaptive fitness and how we create spaces for people with maybe wheelchairs, walkers, things like that, how we can create welcoming spaces for people like that. I have that one coming up in July. So it's really just giving people those opportunities to learn more and expand their learning. And this fall, I'm having a learning lab series. So this is something I haven't done before. It's kind of something new that I'm trying, and getting leaders in a specific space to talk about different ways that we can bring meaningful movement experiences to people, and offering opportunities for people to have a discussion group. So it's peer networking, it's collaborative learning, rather than just like, hey, I'm going to teach you this thing. I always think it's so important to be able to talk to our peers, have conversations like this. The more conversations I have, the more it evolves my thinking on things. So we're talking about exercise to experience. We're talking about designing movement for belonging, and the future of movement within this economy of people living longer. So that's all coming out this fall. If people subscribe to the Agents of Movement newsletter, I talk about those upcoming events, as well as various psychosocial aspects of teaching movement. I have guest writers as well as myself to talk about these subjects that I think are important, that aren't getting enough time in the fitness space specifically, but I think are important for those of us to learn and think about as we're leading people and how we deliver our programs and our classes. So that's all coming up this year. I'm really excited about it. The Learning Lab series is something new. I haven't done this before, so we're going to see how that goes, but I'm excited for it.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't really emphasize enough for our listeners just how much good stuff you put out. If people are on LinkedIn, you're a great follow on LinkedIn. I think you always put up really interesting ideas and information. You get great people on the podcast, and I always learn a lot. So yeah, I mean, really, just thanks for doing all this stuff. I think everything you do, I think you're a huge asset in terms of learning and thinking about things in different ways. And I really like the framing that you've been talking about, this idea of being a leader in the space. I think it's too easy just to keep on doing the same thing, or do whatever somebody learned in a textbook 15 years ago. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for people to really question the way we do things and try to improve upon them. So I think that framing of being a movement leader, I think it's a nice challenge to throw out to other people in this space to try to do better and think about the why and the how of what they're doing.
Yes, definitely. And I think when it comes to working with older adults, like, those are our best leaders. Those are people that we can be inviting into the space.
That's something I wanted to ask, and I was actually I was gonna do the outro really quick, but actually I want to pick up on that because I think that's such an important point. So before I let you go, I want to talk about that. You've done a few good posts over the last year or so, really about that, specifically about how it's really easy just to assume that older adults are just consumers of health services, but actually there's so many ways that we can learn from older adults, and also co-create, and also give them opportunities to lead. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about your thoughts on that.
Yes, we talk a lot about, like, as you had mentioned, of like the over 50 population, let's just call it middle age and beyond, being consumers and the wealth that they have. But we don't talk about them being creators. These are people with a lot of lived experience. And we should be inviting them to be leaders in this space because of that lived experience, because it's an opportunity to lead something for, I think of it as like leading something for your future self. So if you want to continue to be playing on playgrounds into your 60s and 70s, you can be a leader in that area. If you want to continue hiking, then you can be a leader in your community. And it doesn't have to be this formalized thing where you need to get a certification and you need to, work for a company. No, it's just a matter of inviting people to move with you. And I think there's just huge value in that, and inviting people to lead. And even if it's just in the space of our class, and having people lead a session, or how do you think we should, what are some ways that you like to get up and down from the ground? Just finding spaces for people to to lead. I think that really helps boost their confidence for one, and it's giving the spotlight to the people that we're trying to serve, and who best to lead than the people that we're trying to serve. It can't be like we have all the answers. No, the wisdom is always in the room. The wisdom lies in the people that we serve. It's not just in us.
Yeah, I've learned so much from working our Friday class, our Nature Moves group. And it's just exactly like you said. We did one on getting back up the other day. And the class is so good now. I just sort of put out props and step back sometimes and just see what people come up with. And there's something so powerful about that peer, that sort of near peer learning, where it's amazing how working together, people will come up with creative and sort of meaningful and appropriate challenges that I probably wouldn't, or I wouldn't have. Sometimes I wouldn't even feel comfortable coming up with presenting that kind of challenge to the group. But left to their own devices, people are so well attuned, especially when they work with each other, and I think so empathetic, that they come up with ideas that are so much better than anything I might come up with at 9 o'clock at night when I'm scribbling down on my notepad. So I think, yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good place to leave it for today. I'll let you give a final word.
No, I would agree. Like, they are the creators. I think looking to them to give us inspiration for our own classes is huge. We can't just go about it as if we are the professional. We can absolutely learn from the people that we're serving, and creating space and opportunity for them to do that is huge. So yeah.
Cool. Aaron, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew.
Day, night. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
All right, so that was my talk with Erin Eleu. Thought it was a really great conversation. I always learned so much from Erin. I really hope to attend one of her workshops in the future, or maybe do some sort of collaboration with her, because I just think she's really great. So many parts of the conversation I really enjoyed. Again, I really think her focus on the social aspects of movement are really important. She is the person who really taught me to think about the idea of fall preparedness or fall resilience rather than fall prevention. And I think that point is very true. Just think she's a really great thinker in this space. I like that she uses the term movement leader. It's something I shied away from in the past, because to me it sounded too much like someone who would give a TED talk. But actually, it's true. I think that in the space of physical activity and movement, there's so many people who just do the same things without thinking, and just sort of stick to whatever it is that they learned in their personal training course. And, the information in those courses is valid, but I think it is important to bring more lived experience to this. And Erin, I think, is a great example of this. And I also really love the way she uses co-creation, and how important it is to work with the people, not see it as a top-down relationship, but really look at what it means to build a community where people can contribute. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please do leave us a good review wherever you listen to podcasts, and please leave a comment, just because we really like reading the comments. Thanks a lot.